Welcome to the Quotive Corner. Today's quote is one of those observations that was written 3 centuries ago and somehow keeps getting more relevant. It's uncomfortable in the best possible way, and it doesn't care which side of the political aisle you're sitting on. Fair warning. There is no greater tyranny than that which is perpetrated under the shield of the law and in the name of justice. That's attributed to Baron de Montesquieu, Charles-Louis de Secondat, to use his full name, an 18th century French philosopher and political thinker whose work helped shape the architecture of modern democratic governance. His most influential work, The Spirit of the Laws, published in 1748, laid the intellectual groundwork for the separation of powers, the idea that legislative, executive, and judicial authority should be held by distinct bodies as a check against any single concentration of power. The framers of the United States Constitution read him closely. James Madison cited him directly in the Federalist Papers. If you've ever heard the phrase checks and balances, you're living in a world Montesquieu helped to design. A quick honest note on sourcing. This quote circulates widely under his name and is deeply consistent with his documented philosophy, but a precise chapter and page citation in a primary text remains elusive. However, the idea is verifiably his in spirit. So, what is he actually saying, and why does it still sting? The quote identifies something that raw, visible oppression cannot accomplish: legitimacy. A tyrant who simply takes what he wants by force is recognizable. You can point at him, you can name what he's doing. The population may not be able to stop it, but they can at least see it clearly for what it is. That clarity, however grim, carries within it the seeds of resistance. But tyranny that wears the costume of law is a different animal entirely. It arrives not with a boot on the neck, but with paperwork, with procedure, with the solemn language of courts and statutes and official process. It says, this is not oppression, this is the law. And suddenly, the thing that should protect people from abuse becomes the instrument of the abuse itself. The shield becomes the weapon. And the people being harmed are left not only suffering, but unable to easily articulate why, because everything looks technically correct from the outside. That inversion, justice as cover for injustice, is what Montesquieu is calling the greatest tyranny. Not the most violent, not the most visibly brutal, the greatest, because it is the hardest to see, the hardest to name, and the hardest to resist. History has provided no shortage of examples. Laws that codified slavery while courts upheld them as constitutionally sound. Sedition statutes used not to protect public order but to silence political dissent. Legal systems deployed to strip land, rights, and citizenship from populations through processes that were formally correct and morally indefensible. In each case, the machinery of law provided a veneer of legitimacy that made the tyranny more durable, not less, because challenging it required not just courage, but the ability to argue that the law itself was the problem, which is a much harder case to make than simply pointing at obvious brutality. Montesquieu understood this because he understood the nature of power. One of his core convictions, the one that drove his entire argument for separated powers, was that any person or institution entrusted with unchecked authority will eventually abuse it, not because people are uniquely evil, but because the temptation is structural. Power without accountability finds its own justifications, and law, when captured by the powerful, becomes one of the most elegant justifications available. Now, and this is where I want to be careful, because this quote gets pulled in a lot of directions politically, Montesquieu's warning applies universally. It is not the property of any ideology. One side has used legal mechanisms to suppress speech and property rights it found inconvenient. Another side has used them to entrench racial hierarchy and restrict civil liberties. Governments across the political spectrum have imprisoned political opponents through formally correct legal procedures. The costume of law is available to anyone with enough power to put it on. Which is precisely why Montesquieu's structural solution, separation of powers, checks and balances, distributed authority, was designed to be ideology neutral. He wasn't trying to pick the right rulers. He was trying to build a system that made it harder for any rulers to abuse their position, regardless of what they believed. The system was the safeguard, not the virtue of the people running it. We sat with Solzhenitsyn a few episodes back in his observation that freedom and equality exist in genuine tension with each other, that pursuing one tends to constrain the other. Montesquieu is operating in similar territory. He's pointing at the tension between law as protector and law as instrument, between justice as principle and justice as performance. Both are always present. The question is which one is actually operating at any given moment in any given system. This connects to something Frederick Douglass argued a century after Montesquieu, that the Constitution of the United States, read in its true spirit, was an anti-slavery document, even as the legal system built around it perpetuated slavery for nearly a century. Douglass was making exactly Montesquieu's point from the inside of the experience. The law as written and the law as applied were two entirely different things, and the gap between them was where the tyranny lived. So what's the practical takeaway for someone who isn't a constitutional scholar or a political philosopher? I think it's this. Learn to distinguish between the form of justice and its substance, between a process that looks correct and an outcome that actually is, between an authority that invokes the law and one that serves its purpose. Those are not always the same thing, and the gap between them is where some of the most consequential decisions, civic, professional, personal, get made. When someone tells you something is legal, that's useful information. It is not, by itself, a moral argument. When an institution invokes its own rules to justify an outcome, that's worth examining rather than simply accepting. When the machinery of process produces a result that violates the principle the process was supposed to serve, that's the moment Montesquieu was talking about. That's when the shield has become the weapon. Recognizing that moment requires the same quality that Robert Frost pointed toward when he described education as the ability to remain composed in the face of things that challenge you, to stay present and thinking rather than simply deferring to whatever carries authority. It requires the habit of asking not just whether something is lawful, but whether it is just. Those are related questions. They are not the same question. Montesquieu spent his life trying to design systems that kept the gap between them as small as possible. 3 centuries later, the gap is still with us, which means so is the work. Thanks for spending a few minutes here at the Quotive Corner. If this one made you look at something in your own world, an institution, a process, a rule being invoked, with a little more careful scrutiny, good. That's exactly what Montesquieu was asking for. And remember, wisdom isn't in the quote, it's in the reflection. I'll see you in the next one.